Hey everybody, it's Albert, and yes, I'm back. I've been away for a while. Every once in a while, I think it's a good idea to prove you actually have a life. So I didn't really have anything I really wanted to say, so I haven't made any videos for a little bit. I was just taking a break from YouTube, but I'm back. Now, reason I'm back today, and I'll be making some other videos too, but I figured I'd start out with this. Someone sent me a video and asked me if I would respond to it, and it deals with the King James question, of course, the King James only stuff. And, this video, and I'll put a link to it in the description box. The woman narrating this, basically, it's sort of an anti-NIV video, New International Version. Now, personally, I don't like the NIV, but for entirely different reasons. I shouldn't say I don't use it. I tend to distrust dynamic equivalence translations for the most part. Not that I'd say never use that technique at any point, but in extensive use of it, what ends up happening, since you're doing thought for thought rather than word for word, when you get to segments that could be taken in multiple ways, it becomes as much a commentary as a translation. And so I tend to not trust them. In particular, I've seen obvious instances where the ecclesial background of the NIV translators had an effect on the way things were actually translated. And so I'm a little suspicious of that particular translation for those reasons. But in terms of, given that it's not really that much of an issue, it is what it is. And it's not that I think these people are evil. I just think there's a certain amount of bias in it by the nature of that type of translation. That's just what you're going to get. Now, she takes an entirely different view. For her, the NIV is almost satanic. And the way she goes on about this is, first of all, she says she only uses the King James because it's from and this is where I know she's more or less just repeating what she's heard. Okay, I'm sure she's sincere. I'm not trying to say I don't believe she's being dishonest. She doesn't know any better. And you can tell that because she refers to the Textus Receptus manuscripts as opposed to the Westcott and Hort manuscripts. And of course, neither the Textus Receptus nor Westcott and Hort are manuscripts or critical editions. Manuscripts are those handwritten things that they look at and make a critical edition out of. But that's just sort of an indication where this is going. That she really hasn't studied the issue and doesn't really know that much about it. And then finally, she gets into this connect the dots conspiracy theory, where the NIV is owned by HarperCollins, which is owned by Rupert Murdoch, and then she somehow connects it because HarperCollins publishes the Satanic Bibles in some other subsidiary, and that Rupert Murdoch, when his cable stuff, sells porn on his cable things, and then she ties it into because he goes to Rick Warren's church, that somehow Rick Warren. It sort of just goes into these rambling things, and people buy into this stuff. Of course, I think a little bit of reality helps. The New International Version, the project, was started in 1965. I think that's right. About then. I believe sometime in the early 70s, the New Testament version came out, and then the Old Testament was translated by the late 70s. And I believe the whole NIV, the initial project, was published in 1979, and there have been, some corrections and things, and over the years. But basically, the bulk of it was completed by 1979. And it was under Zondervan. Zondervan was not purchased by HarperCollins until 1987, long after the NIV was completed. So how the NIV somehow would be connected to HarperCollins and how that reflects on its translation, I have no idea, unless you're thinking the NIV guys have a time machine. But it gets worse, because then HarperCollins wasn't purchased by Murdoch until 1989. And it wasn't until after that Murdoch started getting involved, I guess, in the cable stuff. And look, if you want to say, I don't want to, if you want to say Rupert Murdoch's a bad guy and you shouldn't buy the NIV because you're lining Rupert Murdoch's pockets on that basis, I don't really have an issue with. But when you start saying somehow that the NIV is corrupt as a translation because of something that occurred at least a decade after it was completed, that's frankly idiotic. It's just insane. There's really, what do you say to something like that? I mean, but this is sort of what happens when you deal with conspiracy theorists. They make any connection. Now, the fact is, I mean, you can make all kinds of connections, because after all, HarperCollins and all that, they also published the King James. There's one other thing she also mentions, that the Word of God is not copyrighted. You should not be copyrighted. And, that the NIV is copyrighted. Well, I got news for you. The King James is copyrighted. Not in the United States, because we don't recognize it, but where it was originally published in England, it's under the cum privilegio, which is owned by the royal. And what happened was, King James placed it under not his own ownership or the translators, but basically placed it under the cum privilegio of the royal crown. So it would not be free to be published freely in England until 50 years after the end of the English royal house. So it's still owned by the royal crown, and I believe that among those who are able to publish it, there's a number of people. You can make an agreement, I believe, with the British Crown to publish it in England. There's two groups that have the right to publish it without asking. They've basically been giving in perpetuity, which are the universities of Oxford and Cambridge, of course. And see, then you got to say, well, isn't that, people like Richard Dawkins work there, and so I mean, you can go all kinds of strange connections. And of course, the British Royal Crown has had its own issues over the years. So are we somehow to judge the King James by the actions of this or that king or queen? I mean, this is how silly it gets. And of course, as I mentioned, Murdoch publishes the King James as well. Now, like I said, if you want to say don't buy. I mean, there's some people who may not buy stuff from HarperCollins because Murdoch owns Fox News. I mean, who knows? And if this is your reason, that's fine. But it has nothing to do with the NIV as a translation. And as I said, I've got my own issues with the NIV as a translation. But this is just idiotic. I mean, frankly, sorry. It's just ridiculous. And that's all I got to say. Thank you very much for your time.